I want to start with a refresher on some of the language we're using from cladistics, our system of classification focusing on common ancestry. A clade is a grouping of all organisms, extinct and living, united by a common ancestor. When a taxonomic grouping encompasses a single clade, we use the term monophyletic to describe it. Eukarya would be an example of a monophyletic taxon. It includes the most recent common ancestor to all eukaryotes, that first mitochondriate nucleated cell, as well as all of its descendants, including you and me. The excavata, the stramanopiles, the alveolata, and the rhizaria, even the SAR superclade, all of these clades we covered in the last lecture are also monophyletic taxa, at least as far as we know based on the available information. The two groups we'll talk about in this lecture, the Unikonta and the Archaeplastida, they're also monophyletic. The Protista, on the other hand, is not monophyletic. It's not a clade, and hence it's wrong to refer to the Protista as a kingdom, which would suggest taxonomic validity for the grouping. Now, why is the Protista not a clade? Well, it has everything to do with the fact that non-protists, and here I mean the animals, the plants, and the fungi, they evolved from predecessors that would be classified as protists. They emerge from lineages that emerge from the original eukaryotic cell. To trace all living protists to their most recent common evolutionary ancestor, you would have to go to that original eukaryote. And the monophyletic clade that radiates from that ancestor is all of eukarya, including animals, plants, and fungi, as well as the things we call protists. So Protista, as a named grouping, is not really a valid taxon, but it is still somewhat useful as a sort of garbage can term to refer to all the eukaryotes other than the animals, plants, and the fungi. Using the terminology from cladistics, Protista is a paraphyletic grouping because it's traceable to a most recent common ancestor that would still be classified as a protist. If you look at that original eukaryotic ancestor, it would be eukaryotic and not an animal, a plant, or a fungus. And so therefore, if it were here today, you'd call it a protist. So that most recent common ancestor would have been a member of the Protista. But this classification of Protista does not encompass all of that ancestor's evolutionary descendants. The animals are left out, the plants are left out, and the fungi are left out. Paraphyly, which is what we have in the case of Protista, and paraphyletic groups, they're less than ideal, but they tend to stick around because of this garbage can aspect of their utility. Now, sometimes we find that a taxon consists of completely unrelated organisms, and this is a state of polyphyly. We would call such a taxon polyphyletic, and usually we disband it immediately in favor of a better classification. Organisms that belong to separate lineage would have a most recent common ancestor that is not part of a taxon. The term algae is sometimes used to refer to all non-plant eukaryotic phototrophs, including non-plant archaeplastids, euglenids, diatoms, brown algae, as well as the dinoflagellates. Now, if you trace these organisms to their most recent common ancestor, it would be the original eukaryotic cell. It would not be photosynthetic and therefore not an alga. Now, all of these lineages largely evolved their states of phototrophy independently of one another. Algae, defined in this traditional way, would be an example of a polyphyletic taxon. Polyphyly is, I hope obviously, very bad. Classifying two organisms that are parts of different clades as a single grouping would be a poor representation of their evolutionary history. Imagine if someone decided that we should have birds and bats classified together in the Terra because both are warm-blooded vertebrates capable of powered flight. The evolutionary implication of this would be that at some point in the past, there was a most recent common ancestor of bats and birds that was the original flight-capable warm-blooded vertebrate. And bats and birds just represent different factions of the single group. And I hope you can see the problem with this. Okay, now here's a question for you to consider. Terra, a group of warm-blooded vertebrates capable of powered flight, including modern bats and birds, and maybe as well as pterosaurs of the Mesozoic. Now, what's the problem here? Okay, so I'm hoping your answer goes something like this. The bats and the birds and the pterosaurs aren't related that closely. Being mammals, bats are more closely related to camels and sloths than they are to birds, while birds, being dinosaurs, are more closely related to alligators and rattlesnakes than they are to bats. The taxon Terra fails because it suggests an incorrect evolutionary history for vertebrates. Now, this concept of a Terra is something I just made up to demonstrate polyphyly, but if it had been established as an accepted piece of science, and then data came in to show a more accurate picture of vertebrate relationships, the only thing to do would be to kill off Terra as a concept and replace it with something better that fits the best available information. Next question. What do people mean when they refer to the Protista? And why is the Protista not a valid taxonomic name? Okay, so if you can't answer this one, you should review the first part of this video. There's no point in my repeating the explanation here. Now I should note that the other classic eukaryotic kingdoms, Plantae, the land plants, fungi, and the metazoa, or animals, are all monophyletic and valid taxa. It's just the Protista that suffers from this problem of paraphyly. Now back to the survey of the four major limbs of the eukarya. We've already done the excavata and the SAR supergroup. The Archaeplastida will only get a very short treatment here because this eukaryotic clade is the context for the plant evolution story that we begin later in this unit. The three monophyletic taxa contained within the Archaeplastida are the red algae, Rhodophyta, the green algae, Chlorophyta, and the Streptophyta. The Streptophyta includes the kingdom Plantae, the land plants, as well as a basal grade of aquatic streptophytes that are neither land plants nor chlorophytes. We'll be going over all of this discussion soon enough. The other major limb here, the Unikonta, is a great group to discuss. Now, thinking about the name Unikonta, what does this suggest about the organisms of this clade? Now, you may remember from an earlier discussion, kont means pole or flagella. In the context of our taxonomic name Heterokonta, we talked about this. Unikonta means having one flagellum only. Now, it might strike you as a perfectly normal thing for a cell to have only one flagellum, and this is probably because our species' flagellated form, the spermatozoon, has only one flagellum. But it's the Unikonta that are the exception here. Flagella are found throughout the eukaryotic clades, and the default state for the rest of flagellated eukaryotes is to have either 2 or 4 flagella. And this includes the plants, as well as the things we've seen in the laboratory, like Euglena. Now, within the Unikonta, the first split breaks apart the amoebozoa from the Opisthekonta. Amoebozoa is, not surprisingly, where you find most amoeba-like organisms. In lab, we might have seen Amoeba proteus. Amoebae characteristically move around using pseudopodia, but some have flagellated stages, and yes, the flagellum is a single, making it clearly a unicont. Amoebae are large, unicellular eating machines, and many are actually quite dangerous to humans if they're able to infect. Entamoeba histolytica is a very dangerous waterborne pathogen causing amoebiasis, which is perhaps the leading cause of human mortality worldwide. There's also Naegleria fowleri, the brain-eating amoeba that you can contract from swimming in ponds as well as under chlorinated pools. Naegleria gains access to human brains when a person takes in the contaminated water through the nose. Once inside your head, these cells will follow your olfactory nerves up to the brain, where they feast on red blood cells and white blood cells. And then also there's acanthamoeba, or thorny amoeba, which is the eye-eating parasite that people sometimes get from improperly disinfected soft contact lenses. Now, besides these scary creatures, the amoebozoa also contains slime molds, and there are two basic varieties here. One is the acellular/plasmodial slime molds, and these are the ones that spread out like a yellow slime over rotting logs, digesting the wood and absorbing the nutrients. We call them acellular because rather than having normal cells with cytoplasms separated by membranes, this organism is one continuous multinucleate cytoplasm, or syncytium, which means together cell. And besides these, there's also the cellular slime molds, notably the species Dictyostelium discoideum, which live most of their lives as free-living unicellular amoebae in soil and moist forest litter. But then they aggregate into this thing that looks like a little slug, and that slug crawls around eventually to find a high spot from which it could disperse its spores. And then the slug metamorphoses into a tall stalk bearing a sporangium at the top, from which sexually recombined spores are released for dispersal. After the spores are released, the spores, if they find the right conditions, will crack open and release amoebae. Now, this is one of the weirder organisms that I know about. Now, you might have already surmised that the Opistheconta are named for something having to do with their flagellum. Being nested within the Unikonta clade, they are also single flagellated cells. They're also part of the Unikonta. But unlike other eukaryotes, the flagellum attaches from behind the cell and pushes the cell along from the rear. Opistho refers to this rear positioning of the flagellum. Most people might think that the rear attachment of a flagellum is normal. But again, that's probably because this is how animal sperm cells use their flagella. Now, we've all seen sperm cells swim in high school sex education videos, if nowhere else. And heck, we've all been sperm cells, at least in part. Now, the truth here is that most flagellated cells use front-attaching flagella that either pull the cell along by having their flagella sweep water toward the cell, or more commonly, the flagella can sweep back over the length of the cell and push water away from the rear of the cell. Only in the Opistheconts, this group of three clades, animals, fungi, and the choanoflagellates, do we see rear attaching flagella. We'll talk about fungi in the next lecture, and we'll open our Unit 3 with a comparison of choanoflagellates and animals.